So hello there and welcome to another Pyroseminar. This is a bit of a follow-up from the one I gave last month, where I looked at community, the commons, and communion. So I want to kind of flesh that out a little bit more. I want to go a slightly different direction. And in the process, I want to be a little bit more transparent about the work that I am trying to do and that many of you are doing with me. And by saying that, what I mean is I don't often talk about the work as a form of reformation, as a form of a fundamentally different way of doing church life, a fundamentally different type of social bond. Because that can sound very grandiose, but that is the work, and that's what I've been, trying to do for many years. So I'm also going to give a definition of what Reformation actually means, and I'm quite excited about giving that definition because I also think it will be useful for understanding something key about psychoanalysis and also political revolutions. Okay, so where will we start? I want to start and tell you a story. Something that happened to me literally about 4 days ago. I was seeing a very close friend of mine, and we were chatting, and I've known her for over 20 years. And I can't remember how we got onto the conversation, but we were talking about the 90s, and we were talking about when we were young. And she talked a little bit about her faith, which we haven't really talked about. She says, "Oh yeah, when I was young and I knew this, she was part of the church." And she said, it all kind of changed when I was about 20. And I said, "Oh yeah, tell me the story." And she was like, "Well, there was this friend of mine, and friend of mine as well, this guy called Ricky, really good guy." And she said that Ricky, he would have been roughly 20, and he had moved away from church life. And my friend, she had been reading Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, right? She was very into her faith. It was a very living faith for her, very much an enriching one, she felt enchanted by the world through her faith. And she'd read this book, and she was keen to meet up with Ricky and ask him about why he was no longer part of the church, why he'd walked away from his faith. And she met up with him at a coffee shop, I think it was Clement's. And, she asked him, tell me the story, tell me what happened. And, Ricky was, it just didn't make sense to me anymore. And she was like, "Well, listen, tell me the reasons. I think I've got answers for these, right? I want you to give it your best shot. Tell me why I shouldn't be part of Christianity anymore, right? Go for it." And Ricky, who's a lovely guy, was like, "I don't want to do that. Like, no, each to their own. And, this is my journey. You're great where you are. It works for you." And she was like, No. Like, I really want you to give it your best shot. We're friends. Like, I want to hear why, and I want to see what you're thinking. And he kept refusing, and she kept poking him and kept asking and kept asking and kept asking until Ricky, who's a very calm guy, I think finally exploded and just gave about 10 reasons in a row, right? And she was a bit kind of taken aback. And although she'd been reading Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the book suddenly didn't work for her. There was nothing that really she had to come back with that sounded good. And she was very discombobulated and a little bit tongue-tied and speechless. So she thought for a bit, and she went, "Okay, well listen, let me go away and think about what you said, and then let's meet up in a couple of weeks." So she went off, and she was thinking about what Ricky had said. And she started reading a bit of C.S. Lewis, and she came across one of C.S. Lewis's famous arguments, liar, lunatic, or Lord, right? If you know it, it's the idea of a trilemma, right? Jesus was either lying, a liar, was either mad, or was who he said he was. That's the kind of idea. And then Lewis goes through all of these. So a couple of weeks pass, and she meets up with Ricky again. And she says to Ricky, here's an interesting discussion, interesting argument. And as she was relaying it to him, she kind of felt that, this argument's actually not that good. And by the time she'd finished relaying it, she was more prone to thinking that the answer, if it was one of the three, was lunatic, right? So this was very traumatic for her. And it wasn't just an intellectual thing. She walked away from that conversation disenchanted, because her faith was not dogmatic. It was actually something that just helped her see beauty in the world. And she told me how, she would be standing in line and she would look at a stranger and she'd just have this profound sense of connection and love. And she would feel this sense of, I would do anything for you. And she would look at nature and she would find it just overwhelmingly beautiful. And after this experience, that was gone. And she was trying to get it back, but it felt like she was walking through treacle, or it felt like she just couldn't get there. She couldn't feel that presence and that warmth and that enchantment. And of course, this was very disconcerting. And she talked to her sister about it. And her sister was like, oh, hey, what we'll do is there's a church up the road. And this was quite a famous church. It's still there. I think it's either called Fitzroy or Fitzwilliam. And there was a very famous preacher, locally famous, guy called Derek Bingham. And he would every week do like an evangelical service at this church. And so her sister said, let's go there and, maybe get some prayer. So they went to the service. Afterwards, they went up to this guy, Derek Bingham, explained what had happened, and people laid hands on her and they prayed for her, and nothing happened. She walked away from that with this weight, with this sense of profound disenchantment. So I was listening to this story and I was really into it. It was fascinating. And then she said this, and then she said, and that's when Icon changed my life. And that took me back and took me aback. Because Icon was this group that I ran with other people. And I wasn't sure she'd really been at very many. And, you don't think that it works. And suddenly this person who you know and have known for many years said, oh, that thing that you did, I went to one of them and it changed my life. And I was like, how did I not know this? And what happened? And she said that around the time that this had happened, maybe a week or two later, Icon was doing an event in Belfast, and she said that she went there on her own, and she walked into the room, and when she sat down, she noticed that in one corner of the room there was this guy called Kazi, really nice guy, very striking looking guy, looked a spitting image of that guy from Sons of Anarchy, Charlie, that actor, so very striking looking guy. And he was standing there in the room with this sweater on. It was like a Tommy Hilfiger sweater. She said it was like an off-the-rack, high street fashion type of sweater. So she saw him standing there in this sweater. And then she saw in the other corner of the room this woman, this American, who had knitting needles and was knitting something, right? Knitting some clothing in the corner of the room. And she sat there. She was feeling very lost, and she was listening to some of the things that were happening. There was DJ music, some poetry, some stuff that was going on, but she was just kind of half taking it in. And she said after about 20 minutes, she realized that the sweater that Kazi was wearing was unraveling. And she didn't notice it at first because it was quite slow, but after 20 or 30 minutes, she noticed that the sweater was slowly, very slowly, coming apart completely. And then she looked more closely and she saw that the threads of the unraveling sweater were tracing across the room to the woman who was knitting. And this woman was knitting something new from the unraveling sweater. This sweater that, as I say, was a kind of off-the-rack, pre-made, nicely made, but pre-made high street fashion sweater. And something new and bespoke was being created. And she said at that moment, she just realized that she didn't need to throw this out. That this thing that she had, this garment that she had, that had kept her warm for many years that she'd been given by her family, lovingly given by her family. She didn't need to throw it out. She could make something new out of it, repeating it, but doing something different. And she said that was all I needed. She said I left, and that weight that I'd been carrying was gone. And that was a lovely story to hear. And I remembered that gathering. I think actually we had a few people knitting, and the threads were going across the room in various ways. And the threads were coming from the pre-made sweater, but I think also from the other knitters as well. We even actually did a version of it at a festival called Greenbelt, which was a large festival, and this was a large venue, and once a year we would do a large icon. This was to a few thousand people, and I remember that we got this woman, Jane, and who was very seminal in making this dress. We went to second-hand stores and we got about 50 old sweaters, and we knitted them together and created this dress that was about 15 feet high, this dress, right? And then Jane stood on a stepladder, and we put the dress on her, so it looked like she was, 18 feet tall or whatever, 20 feet tall. So when you went into this room, she was right in the center where everyone was seated on the ground. She was there with this massive dress right down. And then we had knitters all dotted around the room, and we had threads going from this massive dress to these people who were knitting new garments from the unraveling of this old garment. And I remember there was a certain point in that gathering where people were invited to go up to that dress and cut thread and make a bracelet from the thread. And all I remember about this, and what my friend said, she said, because this was an artistic expression. It was very key. We didn't come in with a very clear idea of what that meant. And I said that to her. I said, like, the way you interpreted that was beautiful, and I think that was partly what we were trying to convey, but we didn't start with, this is what we want to convey, and then, backward engineer something. Somebody just came up with the idea of this image. And that's how often we did icons. We would start with an image, and then we would build around that image. And this image was of an unraveling garment that was then being repurposed into new garments. And I think it was inspired by, I don't know how I found this out, but I had discovered that week, or a couple of weeks before that gathering, that the word raveling means exactly the same as the word unraveling, right? There's a name for this, is antonym. I think antonym's not quite the word. Antonym is a word that means both what it means and its opposite. It means two things that are completely opposite at the same time. This is, I think, called an auto-antonym or something, but it's a word where unraveling, which means pulling apart, when you take the un away, you would think that it would mean the opposite, but you take the un away, and raveling also means to pull apart. And I really like this because it captured something very central about the work that I was trying to do back then in my 20s. That I wasn't trying to unravel my faith or anybody else's so that it could be put back together again, right? Rather, I saw the unraveling as something profoundly powerful in and of itself. So the movement was kind of, if you think of unraveling as something negative, right? You're unraveling, I'm unraveling, and people would say that. That's a metaphor. That's how my friend felt. She felt that she was unraveling. And when she went to that gathering, what happened was not that she was able to put something completely back together again, but the unraveling became something positive. It became raveling. She was able to revel in this raveling. And that's what I want to talk about in this seminar, what that means, and I want to contrast it with what I'm not trying to do. And as many of you know, at the moment, so the first 10 years of my working life with this project, I was doing something called Icon. And what I want to be doing for the next decade, maybe the last decade of my working life, is something called CCon, Church of the Contradiction. I actually, whenever I came up with Church of the Contradiction, I didn't realize it could be shortened to CCon, so actually I quite like, because there's Icon and there's CCon, and they're very connected, but they're also different. What I want to do is talk a little bit about what CCon is, and connect it to this notion of Raveling. And I hope by the end of the seminar to give a sense of, what I'm trying to do, and what those of us who are part of my Patreon and being part of this work are attempting to do. And as I said at the beginning, this is for me a reformation. And a reformation is obviously a theological term. I want to give it a philosophical interpretation, so I'm going to use some terms out of continental philosophy. This, as I say, will help understand also, I think, what political revolution means, and also what personal transformation can mean. So in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there are two terms that are often used that are connected. One is called acting out, and the other is called the passage of the act. There's a French version name for it, but I'm not going to destroy French by saying it. So passage of the act. Now, acting out is a term that's used in a lot of places and in a lot of therapy. And acting out simply means that someone does an act that it has meaning, that can be interpreted within the symbolic system that it's embedded within, right? So acting out. So an example of that is a child who is acting out in school. They are being disruptive in school. They're not doing their homework. They maybe shout at a teacher. They maybe hit another pupil, right? They're acting out. And they're acting out in that is a symptom that has a message, right? And the message is, can be a number of things. It might be that things are really bad at home, that they feel anxious, that they're not able to socially interact with others. They're finding it really difficult to do that, right? So what acting out does is it's a message that has to be deciphered. And when you decipher the message, you can address it. And almost the acting out happens precisely because the child can't symbolize that. They don't know what they're trying to say, so it's said, but it's said in a way that is, as I say, not something that they can themselves understand. But another example politically would be protests. Protests can be seen as a form of acting out in that many protests are asking for things. There's a problem within the society. You protest, you have certain demands, and you want those demands to be met. Right? So again, the protest, and even if the protest is a violent protest and a protest that isn't well articulated, still it can be deciphered, and when you decipher it, you can address the message. Right? Now, the passage of the act is more interesting and initially a bit more difficult to understand. But the passage of the act is an act that doesn't make sense within the dominant frame, the big other, right? The legal, civil, cultural norms of a given society, right? A passage of the act doesn't make sense. It is an explosion of some kind that cannot be interpreted, cannot be decoded, cannot be deciphered. But what it does is it breaks the current interpretive lens and creates a new way of interpreting the past. So the passage of the act is not something that happens within a given order. It's what cracks a given order and creates a new order. I'll give an example. I'll give a few examples. One very basic example might be having a child, right? So you might not want children. You might, value certain things in terms of having money, being able to sleep, being able to travel when you want, right? All of these things that you value. And so having a child would be disastrous, right? It's definitely not something you want. And then let's say, you get pregnant and you have the child. What can often happen is that act breaks the previous way that you understand and interpret the world and retroactively becomes something different. The act is not interpreted by the system. It creates something new, and now you cannot imagine not having a child. And you look at your past life as being empty in some way, as being cracked, as having some missing piece. And that child was the missing piece that you never had. But the trick is that's a retroactive interpretation. It's not that you were missing the child and then you had the child. You had the child and then retroactively the past was reinterpreted as missing something that the child is the answer to. Love is a passage of the act as well, right? Love is a rupture, it's something horrific, it's something that will destroy your life in so many ways, etc., etc. But when you fall in love, you retroactively feel that the person that you meet was someone like the rest of your life is just an Old Testament prophecy waiting for this event to happen. So it retroactively transforms the past. That's what a revolution is in politics, right? In politics, there's reform, where you change things within a given system. A revolution are the occasions whenever an act happens that transforms the very coordinates within which you understand the act itself. Yeah. And that's what a reformation is in theological terms. A reformation is a happening that cannot be interpreted within the existing confessional religious system, but that in happening creates a reinterpretation of the past, so retroactively it begins to make sense. An example Zizek uses in literature, I think is very, very good, is that when a writer like Kafka comes along, Kafka cannot be interpreted whenever Kafka appears. It's an event, right? An event occurs and it doesn't fit within the current kind of literary scene. It's something completely new and explosive. But then in retrospect, you can start to find antecedents. You can find kind of proto-Kafkian kind of writers, right? But the trick is, if Kafka had never appeared, you would never have found those proto-Kafkaesque writers. They only become proto-Kafkaesque in the light of Kafka. So Kafka not only appears in the present, but also retroactively transforms how you read history itself and how you read the past itself. So again, that's what a Reformation is. Reformations don't happen very often. The late Phyllis Tickle would say they happen every, around about 500 years, right? But they're incredibly important because in some respects they're completely new and yet are completely in fidelity to the past. But the fidelity to the past is kind of retroactively created. I'm saying all of that because what we're trying to do with Church of the Contradiction, with pyrotheology, with radical theology, I'd say it cannot be understood within the current institutional form of religion. It doesn't make sense. All of the stuff that we've been exploring over the last few years, and I think most of it's free on YouTube and you can watch it, where we explore the idea of radical negativity and this idea of atheism not being atheistic enough, because there's either theism that says God exists, atheism says God does not exist, but the radical position being God is the name for the inexistent thing, right? All of these kind of ways of speaking, there's no institution that has done this yet. It doesn't make sense within the currently existing institution. In fact, I've got a good example of this that just last week I was trying to find a venue, a potentially new venue for my Spark festival, and there's this beautiful place called Castlewelling Castle, just mention the name, and it's a Christian conference centre. And I wrote to them and I said, I do, and I called it a Christian retreat, right? I said I would love to talk about renting the place. And they wrote back to me and they said, having looked at your website, we are a Christian organization, upholding the teachings of the Bible and, worshipping in the evangelical sense of the term. And having read your website, you should go elsewhere because there's no way we would ever, give the place to you. They said it in a nicer way than that, but they did say, having read your website, we think that it would be better if you found somewhere else, right? Because, they read my work and it doesn't fit in some respects within the actually existing Christian framework. And yet, what's really difficult about it is profoundly using the Christian ideas, this idea of the death of God is central to Christianity. This idea of the alienation of God with God's self is a central Christian notion, but it hasn't found institutional expression. We have people, obviously Hegel is the most important. We have people like Simone Weil. We have people like Thomas Altizer. We have people who've been exploring these ideas, but it hasn't coalesced. It hasn't congealed into a liturgy. And that is the work that I'm really interested in. To create the liturgy is to create an act, a passage of the act, right? This is going to be a series of events that don't make sense within the current system. But if it's successful, we'll reinterpret the current system so suddenly it becomes incredibly in line with it and incredibly faithful to the tradition, even though up until then it can't be understood within it. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. Acting out is an event or a happening that is understood within a current system and can be deciphered within that system. A passage of the act is an event that completely transforms the very interpretive structure out of which it happens. Okay, now then let's talk about that a little bit more. In the last seminar, I mentioned the difference between community, the commons, and communion. And I defined community as any social bond that is connected to identity, right? Identities, shared beliefs, shared values, shared enemies. Right? Now, something I don't think I said clearly enough last month. I said it at the end, but I want to be clear on this, is communities are a vital part of being a social being, of being a human being. We are creatures who identify ourselves in a variety of ways. Now, those identities are always shifting and changing, and there's a sense in which the existentialists show us that identities never fully identify us. Right? So in existentialism, there is a very profound sense in which to be human is to have potentials. Now, this goes back to an ancient medieval idea where you can talk about there's things that exist and there's things that don't exist. Right? And I think it was Aristotle who my primary degree is scholastic philosophy, but it was a long time ago. So I think it was Aristotle who talked about there's not just things that exist and things that don't exist. There's also things that potentially exist. And that third one is really, really important, right? So basically potential existence is something that doesn't exist but could exist. So, for example, I could potentially learn French, but I can't potentially be turned into a frog, right? So, I have the I don't currently speak French, but it is a potential. So it's a non-existent thing, but I have the potential to become a French speaker. But to be turned into an animal is something that I don't have the potential of doing, right? So this is very, very important in scholastic philosophy, this idea of potentiality. But the existentialists use this idea to say that to be a human being is to have potentials. So you're never fully identified with yourself, right? Because there's always these possibilities of becoming something new and different and changing, and you're not at one with yourself, stuff that we've explored elsewhere. So, but community is a place where we embrace identities, and there's nothing wrong. There's bad communities, there's good communities, but having a shared football team is important. I've got two friends who support patrons. They were saying who are that they're like podcasts all about football teams, and they don't pay for any other Patreon stuff, but they pay to be part of this community online of people who support the same football team as they do. And I was talking to one of my friends, Adam, who says he's an Arsenal supporter. He doesn't have any friends who are Arsenal supporters. And he says, like, I feel connected. These are people who are interested in the same team as me, the same history of that team, the same wins and losses, and there's camaraderie, and so that's community. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but communities can become very tight and exclusive, right? But we're all part of communities. Then there's the commons, and I describe the commons in terms of public spaces like libraries and airports and shopping malls or whatever, anywhere where there is no barrier to who can be in that space. Your beliefs and your values and your enemies are all different, and you rub shoulders with people who are potentially different from you, and even you would find offensive and horrible, right? So that's the commons. And there's a strong idea, strong in philosophy, that you need a strong commons for society to exist. You need spaces where people rub up against each other in various ways. And I think there is an argument to say that for a variety of reasons, the commons has been increasingly under threat. And to just name one reason, I think COVID was very damaging for this, because for so many of us, we weren't engaging with anybody. We weren't in the commons. We weren't rubbing shoulders with people in shopping malls or in the library or in some sort of park or anything like that. And so we were less and less rubbing shoulders with people who are other to us, right? And we were more and more hanging out with people who are the same as us. So community is about the same, and the commons is about encountering otherness. So those two terms are kind of important, and they're important for the last session. So you can watch that. I go into it a lot more. But I don't know if I mentioned the example of, like, one of the problems with dating apps is that they don't allow as easily for meeting people who are other than you and different from you, right? So you say what you want, and consciously, you want certain things, and people who think same politically as you or whatever, but actually unconsciously, you want otherness, difference, right? Unconsciously, we enjoy what is not the same, right? We don't think that, so we're kind of looking for someone who is similar to us, but love thrives in mystery and otherness and difference. A topic that we will come back to in the future. I'd like to do a few talks on that subject, but for now I will just park that and say that community is about sameness. The commons is about otherness. We have a big problem at the moment with the reduction of the commons that's becoming more privatized and more like a community. And then I talked about communion. Right. Now, I'm going to use a concrete example of this in terms of religion before I get to communion again. So let's imagine you grew up in a religious tradition like my friend. She grew up as a Moravian in that denomination, and that's what she knew. That was her high street fashion, off-the-shelf garment that she was given. Now, at this point, I think Julia Kristeva makes this point, is that you can't really call this belief at this point. Whenever you're just around people, you grew up around people you all think the same as you, right? You're not even at the point of belief. You're just at the point of acceptance of facts, right? So you grew up in a denomination or with a certain religious belief. That's just the way it is. And you're around people who are the same as you. So that's about sameness. And Kierkegaard called this Christendom. Actually, Christendom is as Christianity is a set of beliefs and practices shared by a group, right? So you have that. And my friend, she had that. And Then what happens when you get a little bit older is you start to encounter people who are other to you. And that will happen to different people at different times. It might be when you go to university or go into the workplace. It might be in school. It doesn't matter. Wherever it happens, it's when you actually encounter people who see the world in a significantly different way to the people that you were surrounded by as you grew up. Now, at this point, and this is where, as I say, if this is about sameness, you grew up with sameness, then at this point in your life, and if you're, you're watching this, think about maybe when that happened for you. What age were you when you first really encountered otherness, someone who didn't believe the same as you and your parents and your other friends, and you became conscious of it, that it became something that was visible? Right, so when that happens, that's your encounter with the other and with otherness. Not a mirror image of yourself, but with something that at first seems potentially weird and strange and even monstrous. And again, as we've talked about previously, ultimately begins to make you question yourself, so you become other to yourself. It's not just that the other person is other, but that their difference makes you question yourself, and suddenly your beliefs start to feel maybe strange, peculiar, and other. Right? Now, at that point, you have a number of options. So I'll outline 3 options that you have. The first option is to close your ears. Just close your ears to it and go back into your community of the same. Now, this is where belief appears, right? So belief proper appears almost, and this is where actually all fundamentalism can arise. Fundamentalism isn't when you're sure you're right in this initial scenario where you just grew up with people, everyone thinks the same, you just think you're right. Fundamentalism is where you repress the otherness, where you close your ears and you then start to affirm it and kind of pretend that you haven't encountered otherness. You try to block otherness out. You build walls, you build a fortress to protect yourself from that otherness. So that's one option that we all have, right? To, as I say, close our ears, which is not what my friend did, which is really interesting because that's a very common response. But she didn't do that. Second thing you might do, very common response, is you move to a different community. Right, so you give up on one community and try another. Right, you give up on, the enchantment of religion, and you embrace the enchantment of, commodity satisfaction, or psychedelic enlightenment, or whatever it is, or some other religious practice, or some other place. So you just, you swap out one sameness for another, or you can synthesize, which I know again is very common. I know a lot of people who do this who then look at the various options, the various, say, religious beliefs that are on offer, and they, treat it like a bit of a buffet, and they take a little bit from various ones and they create something else, right? So those are 3 things. Go back to the old one, go to something new, or create a synthesis out of a few different possibilities. That is very common. Also, I've noticed within Christianity, evangelical Christianity, there is an adoption of the word deconstruction. They use it in a different way than it means in philosophy, but what it seems to mean within the church is it's the point when you encounter otherness and you begin to take apart your beliefs that you just assumed were true, right? So in deconstruction, in this term, you start to pull things apart, you start to look at things differently. But then what's often said, not by everybody, but some people say, well, you do the deconstruction to then reconstruct. Right, so you deconstruct, you take apart, and then you kind of construct something new, and something maybe that's better, something that's more secure, right? It's almost like you built a house which wasn't strong foundations, and so you build something new. And that's one way of interpreting what we were doing at that icon gathering. One way of interpreting that is we were unraveling something that was given, and we were creating something new out of it, right? But we were careful to have lots of different ravelings and unravelings all around so that you as a participant, were in the center of this experience of raveling, right? So it was less about creating something new, and more about being able to tolerate and even enjoy. I say even enjoy and also enjoy and fundamentally enjoy the raveling process itself. So traditionally, you go like there's the same, you've got your religious community, then you encounter otherness, people who help you question your beliefs, whether you want them to or not, like what Ricky did with my friend, where she began to unravel. To say that there's various reactionary moves that go backwards, moves that are to conserve something or create something new. But that's not what pyrotheology is about. It's not what radical theology is about. Radical theology is about turning unraveling into raveling. And that means that the process of coming apart becomes positive. It's positivized. It becomes something powerful. So this is dialecticism. So what I've just described is non-dialectical solutions to this problem. You grew up religious with the same, you encounter otherness, you deconstruct, and as I say, you maybe do fundamentalism, or maybe you create something new, or maybe you're kind of more progressive and hold a few doubts, but you kind of ultimately trying to, like, as in, you go, I still believe certain things, but I could be wrong, right? I might be wrong, so you hold lightly to your beliefs, right? That's not what radical theology is doing in the form that I'm exploring. It is, if I describe it like this, there is sameness, there is otherness, and then there is the sameness of otherness itself. And what that means is that what we all share in common, what makes us the same, is that we are all other to each other and other to ourselves. So in the first move, the otherness is simply I'm being pulled apart, I'm deconstructing in that religious sense of the term, I'm taking apart. But when you move to the third position, and this is communion, communion is where you go, oh, it's not about reconstructing something so much as it's about saying that there is something inherently non-deterministic, non-mechanistic, non-materialist at the heart of everything. There is a fundamental spontaneity, novelty, asymmetry at the heart of reality itself. Reality is not a closed system that we don't fully understand, but there is something about the system itself that doesn't fully understand itself. There is a quantum dimension to reality itself. This is what the death of God means in radical theology, that God is not at one with God's self. God is not the unknown God, but the unknowing God, which is a metaphor for saying that there is a dimension of mystery that is inherent to everything. And that's what unifies us. So on a very simple level, to be a human being is to be a creature of desire, where you cannot fully articulate your desires, you cannot fully meet your desires, that longing is part of what it is to be human. And instead of always trying to overcome your longing, you can cultivate a longing for your longing. You can cultivate a desire for your desire, a desire for desire itself, and that's called drive. So you're not always trying to fulfill your desire, but also realizing that there's something beautiful about desire itself. And desire is the manifestation of not having, right? You desire what you do not have. So there's a certain sense in which you start to enjoy what you do not have. And the name for the fundamental not having is God, the signifier for that which can never be had, a fundamental lack that can never be grasped, right? That's the signifier, God. So now you start to explore the idea of God as a fundamental nothing, and religion, the religion that comes out of this notion, as a set of rituals, a liturgy that is faithful to that lack, to that nothing, to that non-being. And that's why I call it a desert in the oasis, right? It's a space of not getting, of not having, of embracing a type of fundamental lack, right? And this, I don't think, can be understood within the current institutional system. It requires something new. It is a new wine that will rupture the old wineskins. It just will. So what we have to do is we have to create these liturgies. We just have to do it. And when we do it, they won't be understood until they happen. And if they're successful, they will create a new interpretive frame within which they can be understood. So they will find their justification after the fact. Now, what I'm going to be doing, and I hope I can do this next month, is I'm going to release some videos that are showing examples of what these liturgies look like. And these are object lessons that are designed to show you so that you might find ways of doing these yourself, right? And experiment with them. That's what I want to do. I want to show some examples in order to inspire people to start to do these for themselves. And I also want to do more of them as well. But it is a type of liturgy in which the lack becomes positivized. And this is dialectic. So again, if you think of it like, I use the term sameness, otherness. The otherness is what makes us the same. I think I talked about this last month, which is, in terms of the conservative position today is we're all unified by certain positive characteristics, some positive identities, that hit us all. We're all under the same facts. We're all under the same meritocracy, et cetera, et cetera. So we all have equality, right? Equality under the law. And then in the liberal left, you have the idea that all universals are actually hidden prejudices that help some people over others. And so what you have is not equality but equity, different groups getting different things, and there's just lots of different identities, and we find ways of intersecting. And then what I'm arguing is, no, there is a universal, but the universal isn't the positive. The universal is negativity itself. To be a human is to experience lack, longing, desire, and this is what unifies us. And communion is a social gathering around the recognition of that loss and longing at the heart of all reality, because communion is a meal around the death of God, where you consume that death, where you eat it, and you become that, you kind of in a sense incarnate that lack and that loss, and it becomes positive. It's a positivity, right? So that's the kind of the dialectic move. That is the move from community through the commons into communion. Communion is like community in a sense of it is a social bond, but it is a social bond not connected to your identities. It's connected to the fact that to be a creature of language is to be a creature of longing, a creature of desire, a creature of suffering. I think I talked about this last month at Simone Weil, when she talks about suffering being universal. She doesn't mean that we all suffer the loss of people we love, or we all experience poverty, or we all experience hunger, because we don't all encounter the same sufferings, the same contingent sufferings, and some people experience many more of those and some people less. But for Simone Weil, when she talks about suffering, she means that suffering is the sense of longing, of not having. And to be a creature is to have ontological suffering, because it is to experience not having, a type of loss. And what our contemporary society does is it covers over that by saying either it doesn't exist, which is really interesting. This is important because a lot of people critique contemporary society, contemporary capitalism, by saying that it alienates us, right? But Todd McGowan brilliantly argues, and people like Macusa and others argue that the problem is actually our contemporary society tells us we're not alienated. And it creates this really strange thing in which we're surrounded by who was it who talked about amusing ourselves to death, that book. But is that, we all can watch Netflix and we can go out and we can do all of these things, and in a sense we can feel we can't even symbolize the alienation because we can get everything we want, right? Seems to be everything we want and need, and food from around the world you can order on apps and all of this stuff. So we can't even articulate our alienation, and actually the problem is we're not able to articulate our alienation. It's so hidden that, and Aldous Huxley explores this in Brave New Worlds, that you don't even have a language. And Orwell in 1984 explores this, that there's not even a language to describe your alienation. So if we imagine contemporary society where we can seemingly have everything we want and do everything we want and be all that we can be and optimize and life hack and all of that, and yet in the midst of it we feel burnout, fatigue, we have depression, melancholy, anxiety disorders, all of this stuff, and we can't articulate why, because we're alienated from our alienation. We haven't a way to symbolize it and ultimately kind of affirm our alienation. So the contemporary society actually gives us what we want, which is alienation, but it does it in a destructive way because it pretends it doesn't. It pretends it gives us an answer to that alienation. What CCON does, what the communion does, is it draws out and symbolizes this alienation through music, through comedy, through cabaret, through poetry, through spoken word of various kinds, sermons. It articulates this inherent, my God, why have you forsaken me? This inherent form of alienation. And we see that in our own individual alienation, in our own aloneness, we are connected. And actually in the videos that we'll be releasing hopefully next month, there's a short film by Helen called Alone, and it's spelled Allone, which kind of basically has the word all in it. So it's about we're all alone, and we're all connected in our aloneness. It's an incredible short film that you'll see if you haven't seen it already. That explores this idea that it's actually in our aloneness, in our self-alienation, that I connect with you. In your suffering, that's where we meet. And I can provide, ideally, and this is what I want to provide, and what these communities want to provide, I want to provide a harbour for your alienation, for your aloneness. Not answer it, but provide a space where it can be shared, and where you can do that for me. And in that space where we can share that aloneness, it feels less lonely. It robs it of its sting. Okay, I think I'll stop there. I'll see if there's any questions anybody has on the video. Oh yes, here we go. Oh, somebody, greetings from Russia. Wow, that's very cool. Oh, your deeds mean a lot to me. Thank you. I don't speak English well enough to say how cool you are. Thank you so much. Well, thank you from Russia. I have a good friend from Russia who lives in LA now, and I've got a real desire to go there. Oh yes, there's lots of people here. Oh yeah, Luke says the identity of identity and non-identity, a multi-unity. Christ the eternal Tao. Yeah, that's very good. It's weird, difficult to define. Oh yeah, communion of persons downstream of a man named Paul Vanderklay. I don't know who that is, Paul Vanderklay. I'll have to look that up. Oh, it's nice to see people are there and making comments. I don't see many questions, just people chatting. So we will have time next week to dissect this more. So hopefully if you're on my Patreon, you'll join me next week on Zoom, and we can kind of go a little bit deeper into this. What I try to do tonight, I always love to mix theory with practice and with storytelling, and hopefully I try to get that mix tonight, because these ideas are quite complicated. We looked at acting out, passage of the act, reformation, dialectic, otherness, sameness. All of those are quite complex things, but I did also try to ground it in some examples. And ultimately, next month, I want to, as I say, offer you some videos, because we never videoed any of Icon. Icon was kind of pre all of that, so I don't have anything from then. So creating new things to show examples of what this might look like. Padraig O'Tuama is involved, and Duke Special, and others. So that will hopefully come out next month. We just have to finish editing, and I'm excited to share it with you. So have a great night. Take care. Bye-bye.